Armageddon, Deep Impact, The Walking Dead. What do those titles have in common? They're about the apocalypse. This is Nightsaber Z42, and today we're canceling the apocalypse with a review of Ark. Let's dive in. So here we have the Ark book. Very nice illustration on the very cover, and not really much of anything else along the back. The insides are completely bare, so a lot of wasted space there, but I guess that's okay. No artwork or anything, although they could have filled it with several tables, and there's actually some tables inside that we'll see later on that could actually fill this space, so it's kind of really interesting that they didn't really utilize that option. So, oh's wells. The table of contents is actually really well done. It has very clear and concise title headings, and even the titles or the chapters are actually broken down into different sections, which are very clear. It gives you all the information that you need to know. It kind of would almost replace the index, but let's be honest, not really. There is an index at the very back, which is a lot more in-depth information, or at least in terms of page numbers, what you would need. But I do like the table of contents. There's no weird headings or anything like that to make note of here. A quick word about the artwork. It is very well done. Momoto's basically wrote and provided the layout and did all of the artwork for this book, so kudos to anybody that can actually do everything for a project like this. And the artwork itself is very weird, but it is very consistent. And by weird, I mean just like, how Limitations of the Flame Princess is weird, or you might see like some very weird creatures and stuff like that. Very well done, and this book is very much trying to incite that inspiration as you look at it. So let's get on to the introduction. So what exactly is Ark? Well, Ark is a rules-light, tension-heavy fantasy tabletop role-playing game where anyone can create urgent stories ticking down to a seemingly inescapable apocalypse. There you go, right there. That is what I would have really liked to have known when I actually backed this on Kickstarter. Because when I backed it on Kickstarter, all I got was, hey, this is a book by Momoto's, it's weird, and it's about handling the apocalypse. That's kind of all I got. Didn't really give me much other information other than that. But that right there, that one sentence kind of really sums it all up. That's what Ark is. That's what this game is trying to emulate. So let's see what we have. So every book seems to have an introduction chapter. This one's no exception. So you have little titles like Why Play Ark, or What Do You Need to Play, which honestly all you need are the character sheets and d6s, and that's it. This is a roll under system using d6s, which we'll get into when we actually get to the core mechanics of the game. Who is the guide? The guide is the GM, but more information on who that person is and what they do. By the way, they do a lot in this game, so be prepared. If you are the GM, you're going to be planning like crazy for this. And how do you play Ark? This is just a basic synopsis of how a typical session would go. So again, roll under your target number, roll a d6, roll under your target number. That's how you do skills. So that's really all you need to know. How do you read Ark? This is basically just the different chapters and where you would go to find information. It's very light, no artwork or anything, but I do really like how this book highlights important information, and it also gives certain text or certain words in bold. It's a very good stylistic choice. It draws your eyes to those really pertinent bits. So time, lengths, and pronouns. This game is actually played over real time. That's really weird to say or even think about. So for example, every 10 minutes or every half hour, the doomsday clock starts ticking down, or ticks down, does a tick down, let's just say. So you have to be very conscious about how much time is on the clock. And as a player, you're going to be conscious about how much time you're wasting. Like if you're part of my groups, we waste a lot of time just with chit chat or even role playing. So you got to really keep track of that kind of stuff in this game. Lengths and short distances are indicated by heights, meaning an average person is around 5 to 6 feet. So one height is about that much. I absolutely do not like that. I wish they had just called it a unit, if anything, because height, that's abstracted away. Like, yeah, the average person might be between 5 and 6 feet, but not everybody is going to fall within that range. And pronouns, of course. We have a little blurb about that. So then let's get into chapter 1 about doom. The doom is a cataclysmic event threatening to devastate the world of the heroes or their people. In Ark, the hero's goal is preventing this apocalypse. So that is what you're going to be doing as a player. You're going to try to stop the apocalypse. You're canceling it, as they say. The beginning gives the GM some tips and some things to think about when designing the apocalypse around the campaign, or the campaign around the apocalypse, however you prefer to think of it. This game makes it very clear that this is supposed to be a short game. It's supposed to be played short term. This isn't something that you're going to be playing for years upon years or even months. There's a nice handy table of like on page 32 about splitting up your sessions and how the doomsday clock ticks down and stuff like that. And that's very handy to think about it that way. So for example, if you know that you're only going to be playing this game for 2 or 3 sessions long, then the number of moments you're going to have is about 1.5 per hour of play. The doomsday clock is going to advance every hour. So things like that. Or if you're having more than 4 sessions, then the doomsday clock is going to advance every session. Probably at the end of every session. There's a lot of keeping track of things for the GM, which it's kind of tedious in a way. But then again, as the GM, if you're playing 5th edition, you're already keeping track of a lot of things and you probably are used to. I should also point out that the apocalypse is a fairly specific term. The book also mentions that your apocalypse might be in smaller scope, so that is also something to consider. And that could also expand into, larger campaigns or extended campaigns where you thwart one small detail, but then the next arc of your story, it builds up until you finally get to that, the world is going to end or not. We have a little blurb about omens. Omens are story fronts contributing to the advancing of the doom. So smaller segments of time, if you will, or smaller segments of events that eventually will lead up to the doom. For example, if your doom is the escape of the demon lord, hungry to consume the entire kingdom, the omens could be a local cult is hoarding gold and gems for a secret ritual. The Lord's Council has disbanded, leaving royal defense scant and uncoordinated, and the Grey Magus has disappeared, leaving only a mysterious map. So these omens are always on the clock. Whether or not your players are interacting with that omen, it doesn't matter because the omens are happening in the background. They are going to trigger off eventually. So for example, the local cult hoarding golden gems for a secret ritual, if your players aren't really interacting with that, that's still going on, and eventually they're going to do something with that ritual. They're either going to complete it, or maybe it sets off like a nuclear type like magical explosion which devastates the entire world or something like that. It's still going to happen. So just because the players aren't doing anything with it or aren't even aware of it at the time, it's still happening in the background. And in fact, as the doom ticks down, you're getting rid of those events. Those events are happening in time. So, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to have to split those omens into different segments. So, when the doomsday clock ticks down, you're getting rid of that omen, and that's what this page is for. So, lots of timekeeping to keep track of, basically, for the GM. And I should also point out that you aren't just ticking down one omen. You would actually roll, like, I think a d6, and on a 5 or a 6, you're consuming more. I think that's what I got out of that. Yeah. Roll d6 equal to the number of omens still in play, consuming one more moment for every 5 or 6. So you could essentially just have a very short session, is what I'm getting at. So be aware of that. You might use that rule, you might not. So if you want a softer risk, then you might just do one, just to kind of extend your play. If you know that you're going to be playing this for a little bit, you might do that. Remember, if your heroes complete their quest and the doom is vanquished, you give them a pat on the back and say, "Good job, I'll see you at work on Monday." If they fail, then you can choose what happens next. You could choose an epilogue, or the players can choose an epilogue for what happens after the world ends. So maybe it's a fallout situation and, civilization still goes along. Maybe some of the players survive that nuclear fallout and they're starting to come out. You can have them do a new beginning, so the apocalypse happened, and now what happens after that? You have new characters, or maybe the offsprings of the characters who failed in their quest, and it's time for round 2. Or you could rewind time. I personally am not a big fan of number 3, rewinding time, but it can actually be really fun to do in some Groundhog's Day shenanigans with that. I'm talking about the movie, by the way, with Bill Murray. If you haven't seen that movie, then definitely watch it on Groundhog's Day, which is February 2nd for my non-US friends. Anyways, let's get into Chapter 2, Hero Creation. Just like with any OSR type like game, hero creation is actually fairly simple. If you've actually played any OSR games, and you already know what to expect in a way. There's a lot of dice, well, not a whole lot of dice rolling, but there is a lot of randomness to it. And one of the first things that you agree to is an explanation that your players should have the freedom to be whoever they want to be, whether they're blue, amphibious, or reptilian, or a T-Rex dude. They should be able to do that, as long as it fits within your genre style or play style. Now, one fault that I automatically see here is that the random generation things that happen in this book is always in 6s. You're rolling a d6, and I really would have liked to have seen this have been expanded out to like larger tables, like a d100 table, like your hero is and just have like a lot of different lists for what your hero could be or who they are and whatever and section is. That just seems like they really limited themselves to that. And I know that somebody's going to do that, like make a really in-depth list that just has a lot of different variety in it. But, that just means somebody has to do it. And who wants to do that? Well, I'm sure somebody would like to do it. So this game is also meant to be used in just about any genre. But it's very clear that this is more of a fantasy type. If you try to do this in like a sci-fi setting, then there's going to be some tinkering that you'll have to do with that, but it can be done. So first off, we get step number 1. By the way, there's no character sheet attached to this book. You actually have to go to rpg.com to get the character sheet and print them off. But the character sheet actually does look pretty nice. It's very clear at what's going on here. And, things like blood and guts, 2d6 plus mod equals max, that's right there. It tells you what to do. So we're going to move on from the character sheet because I don't have it. First step, determine your approach scores. There are 3 different approaches. You have the creative approach for people who really like to get creative with their skill usage. Careful approaches for those who pay attention to detail. And then you have the concerted approach. So effort, grit, and willpower. So these three different will or approaches determine how you use your skills. So you have a lot of different skills. So let's say I'm trying to observe something. I could either creatively observe something, as long as you have a really good explanation on how you're doing that. You could carefully observe something, or you could just keep observing concerted style until you find something, I guess. This is really like Legend of the Five Rings, but just not as totally in depth as it was in that game. Because in that game, you had like, what, five different approaches for each skill. You only get three in this game. And I also have to really wonder why it is the way it is. Like, in other systems, it's very clear that it makes sense with that system or whatever that game is trying to envision. I'm just having a really hard time understanding why, for like this is supposed to be like about the apocalypse and heroes and stuff like that. Why do we have three different approaches, and why are they those approaches? It just seems like a system that was tacked on a little bit. So I don't know. I'm probably the wrong person to really ask about this, but that's something that I noticed when I was reading through this book. And I'll explain that later in my final thoughts. By the way, the maximum number that you can have for any approach is +3, which means that you're an expert. So you can never go above +3, and probably for good reason. Step 2 is all about your blood and guts. So blood is like your HP for physicalness, or your physical HP, while guts is your mental HP. If either goes down to, or if both go down to 0, or if one goes down to 0 and you start taking hits, your approaches start taking those hits. And if all three of your approaches are 0, then you're kind of dead. So don't let that happen. The really interesting thing about blood and guts is that whenever you take a long rest, you can choose to heal some of your max HP, or you could roll 2d6, add those applicable modifiers, and that becomes your new HP stat for blood or guts. It's very interesting, and I kind of really wish that they had explained why that is the case. Why can you do that? I mean, don't get me wrong. That's a very interesting system that I've never seen used in any other system before. But it's like, why? Anyways, step 3 is all about your skills. So you have different categories like knowledge skills, social skills, physical skills, and pragmatic skills, which I don't know what that means, or prowess skills. So for knowledge skills, that'll be things like your academic, culture. Observe is not something that I would really make into a knowledge skill, because that just doesn't seem right. You don't know by observing. That's something that you figure out. And I think that would be more of like your prowess. No, probably not your prowess. I don't know. It just doesn't seem right to put observe in knowledge. But tactics, you also have in knowledge. For social, you have charisma, guile, impose, and insight. For physical skills, you have things like acrobatics, coordination, physique, and weaponry. Pragmatic is things like artistry, tinkering, survival, trade. And prowess, you have arcana and focus. So very interesting. So you can choose to use the standard array for determining your skills, allocate 2 or +2 to 2 skills and +1 to 3 skills, or you could randomly roll them on this handy dandy chart. And at first, when I was looking at this chart, it didn't make sense, but you're rolling one die, determining the first value, and then you roll the second d6 to determine which one it is. So if you roll a 1, 2, or 3 for your first die, you're looking at the top half. If you roll a 4, 5, or 6, you're looking at the bottom half. So really interesting. Step 4 is all about determining your inventory. So you choose from a list of items from their categories like damage and defense, supplies and sundries, oddities and valuables, spells and techniques. And you can buy, or not really buy, but you get those items, and the total cannot equal 30 or more than 30. Now, if you've rolled poorly in approaches, blood and guts, or skills, you actually get extra inventory room for your hero, which kind of a little bit of a letdown. Like, who wants to be the donkey for their group just because they rolled really poorly and have a crappy character? Like, it just doesn't seem right. Anyways, there's a lot of different items, so it's really worth actually reading them. Some of them are actually quite funny, but I'm not going to read through this list here. Again, I actually think 24 is a happy medium. It's not too much, but it's also not too few. There's a lot of variety there. Step 5 is about background information for your character, and if, let's be honest, you're probably going to play with people who are going to make really intricate backgrounds for their characters. So these 3 questions probably just wouldn't cut it. But for newcomers or beginners to role playing games, these 3 questions would actually probably give them a good head start. Bonds is step 6. Okay, let's talk about bonds. I was really confused when I read through this section the first time. It actually took me about 2 or 3 different readings on different days before I actually understood what they were talking about. So bonds, well, obviously bonds represent the relationship between 2 heroes, like friendship and things like that. So you have these different quadrants for your bonds, okay? Each small box is a minor bond. You can have 4 minor bonds to equal a major bond. Now these bonds are used for like re-rolling a roll or providing assistance for a skill, as long as you're able to actually do that skill. You can actually help them accomplish a roll for that skill. And so you would just take away that many minor bonds or major bonds and do that thing. Now, you could also get bonds for things like accepting an inconvenience for an ally or accepting harm or serious risk. You would gain +1 or maybe +2 minor bonds. So that's a very interesting mechanic. I do like that, and I would probably plug that into other systems that weren't this game. It's really interesting. It would be very interesting to kind of make it work for other systems, because it is a very interesting mechanic. And then that's it. That's how you create a character. It's actually fairly easy. You just need to understand some of the vocabulary and the terminology of what they're talking about, and really understand the mechanics before you start actually allocating points to this and that. So congratulations, you're done with hero creation. Of course, you could always spend experience points later down the road to increase said skills, blood and guts, and all of that stuff. Now let's get to chapter 3, the core rules. As stated before, this is a roll under d6 system. So when making a skill check, you're going to roll a d6. Your target number is your skill plus your approach. Roll your d6 and you have to roll under that. Now, remember, you can only at maximum have a +3 in any of the approaches. So if you are at a 3 creative and you are fairly skilled, like maybe you have survival at +2, that's going to be, you're going to need to roll under a 5. Okay? If you roll a 5, then you still fail. You have to roll under a 5. Rolling a 1 is like a critical success. And there are different rules about like taking a success with a disadvantage or something like that. That is a thing in this game. You do get a nice summary of rules here. I really wish that these 2 pages were like on the inside covers. That would have been a really great place to put those reminders. Instead, we got nothing, and this is like literally in the middle of the book. So there's also another 2 pages later on that would have been really good for the other side of the inside cover, but yeah. So you get skill checks. You can make skill checks easier or harder depending on what's happening or if it's really impossible to do, which is nice, thank goodness, because let's be honest, if you have that one player who's got like a 7 in a skill plus approach, then that's pretty much what they're going to be using like all the time. So you can succeed with a consequence if you equal the target number. If you fail, you can still take a hit with blood or guts to turn that into a success with consequence. So you don't have to outright fail. There are ways out. And then there's conflict, so fighting basically. And you have different actions that you can take, like stand your ground, harm others, which is going to be things like attacking, your non-harmful actions for like rolling skill checks in combat. Non-harmful actions, that's still the same thing. You can assist someone or do something else. You can use a spell or technique, or you can move far, far away. So that would be like more than 10 feet if we're thinking in terms of feet. Height, it's like if you're moving more than 2 height, then you would move far. So this is actually this brings me up to a very interesting concept. So if you're used to playing things like old school Essentials or any other OSR type game where initiative is taken by what you're doing, then this will be familiar territory. But for me, it's not. And I actually don't like that system because it becomes long and tedious, and it's just another thing for the GMs to keep track of. So you have an initiative category for your initiative in this system. There's 5 different steps. So first would be characters and creatures who are standing the ground. If you're standing your ground, then you're going first. Second action, or the second step, would be for those taking non-harmful actions. The third step would be for those attacking others. The fourth step would be for anybody using a spell or technique. And the fifth step and the last step would be for those that are moving far, far away. So remember, more than 2 heights. Yeah, that's needlessly confusing, and it adds a lot more to the GM's list of things to do for this game. I really don't like it. It's needlessly tedious. Let's just put it at that and leave it at that. More nice artwork. And of course, you do get rules for death. So remember, if your 3 approaches reach zeros, then you're going to make a choice. You're either going to come back with some sort of disfigurement, or you're just going to die. Reroll a new character. And you can also get experience points for your character. So if you want to increase an approach score, it's going to be 3 times its next XP value. Increasing a skill rank by 1 is 2 times its next XP value, and increasing a modifier for blood or guts only costs 1, which is the new value of the XP, or the new value in XP. So very interesting that. I actually did like the 3-2-1 thing that they had going there. So let's talk about Chapter 4, Spells and Techniques. So this chapter serves as the magic chapter that you would see in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, or at least the player's handbook. I'm going to be upright with you. I don't like the fact that they split up spells and techniques because there's no discernment between the two whatsoever. They don't explain what the difference is, and some of the techniques are quite literally spell-like. So why would you have 2 different categories when they are functionally the same thing? So that's my 2 cents. Let's get on with this. Spells and techniques, it is a very interesting mechanic, mainly because you're not just casting a spell or doing a technique or whatever it is you do to do a technique. You do a technique, you have used one instance of that. You might have multiple instances of a spell. Okay? Kind of like how spells work in 5th edition, but when you take a long rest, you don't automatically regain those instances back. Instead, you actually have to perform a ritual when you perform the long rest to get that spell or technique back. So, for example, let's take a look at Bind Weapon. You summon a +2 weapon. Its specific nature is up to your imagination. Flaming swords are nice, though. This weapon can neither be destroyed nor disarmed. The ritual to get that instance back is to break a non-magical weapon gifted to you by someone else. So spells, while powerful as they are, and by spells I mean spells and techniques, don't expect me to say those two because that's just tedious, but spells are powerful, but in order to get them back, you actually have to do things that are going to hold you and the party up. Let's be honest. Things like Burn the Past is really interesting. Target a creature you see, their memory of the past in story hour is erased. The ritual to get that back is you're going to burn a memento or letter from someone you dearly miss. I hope you have a lot of those, by the way, or else you're probably not going to be using that spell a whole lot. Each spell and technique has an enhanced version. So, for example, Lifebringer. You or any creature you touch gain 4 blood and 4 guts. The enhanced version of that is you're going to heal 7 blood and 7 guts instead. There are different requirements for using the enhanced version, and it's kind of different from spell to spell, and it's really interesting. By the way, the ritual for that Lifebringer is to consume at least 1 handful of a humanoid's flesh. So yeah, have fun with that. Of course, it's your game. You can choose to use the rituals in enhanced versions or not, but I think they really did something interesting with this mechanic. I really do like the fact that spells and techniques are going to be really powerful, but to get them back, you're going to have to do something that's not just doing a rest. I really do like that. I like that spells are both powerful, but they're also going to have a drawback to them, and techniques as well. So techniques are, I honestly have no idea what the difference is because they function the exact same way. So there is that. There's a whole list of spells and techniques to read through, which I'm not going to read to you, but they are actually really interesting and cool. I really do like that. Like if I was going to play a game that used a system like this, like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, I might actually use something similar to this where you might have an enhanced version or you might have to do some sort of a ritual to gain those spells back. But then again, spell usage in Lamentations of the Flame Princess is already hard enough as is. So let's get into the guide toolkit. So this is everything that the guide needs to know for running the game. And at the very beginning, you have a nice 2-page spread of some more reminders of some of the rules, like the ratings and scales and target numbers and stuff like that. That would have been really, really handy to have like on the inside back cover. Just saying, it's wasted space. So we have creating custom characters and adversaries, a really nice table. This is really useful for creating adversaries on the fly, or even if you're pulling monsters from a different system because you want to use that module, you would plug them in through here. So you might have an average type creature, and then you might make them a little bit complex by giving them some techniques and spells and stuff like that. And of course, you could always change the spells and techniques and make them more unique for that adversary or NPC. And of course, there's some guides to running the game, but really this is just a guide to running any game because this is just something that you're going to want to always be mindful of, like being careful not to trigger anybody and stuff like that. And that's pretty much all there is for this chapter. Like, honestly, it's just a lot of a different advice on being a good game master with very little about the system. So there's that. More nice artwork, by the way. And then we get to the appendices. The appendices are actually really, really useful. Like, you have things like sample hero creations, sample scene and skill checks, which are really good to just read through, especially if you've never played with a system like this before. You've got a sample conflict here, and you got some more sample heroes and some sample creatures to play around with. So it's a lot of things for the GM. It's more things for the GM, but it's a lot of good stuff for the GM. So let's get to my final thoughts. Overall, this is a pretty book to look at. I'm not gonna lie. The artwork is solid, it's very consistent, it's weird, it's really good. There's some interesting concepts here, but the concepts I find interesting can easily be plugged into other systems. So what that means is this book is not just the sum of its, or is the sum of its different mechanics, because if you take one mechanic out, the whole system doesn't fall apart. I could run this game without the Doom system, but would that be very fun? Probably. I mean, there's enough of the spells and techniques there to make it really interesting, as long as you have a really good world to play in. So the system, what about the system? The system is very light. It reminds me of Lamentations of the Flame Princess, which I've mentioned a lot of times. And it even reminds me a little bit of Merkborg, which I'll explain here in a little bit. So what about the Doom Clock? To me, that's just a gimmick. None of the mechanics in this book are necessary. Let's be honest. The Doom mechanic is not necessary. It's just a gimmick there to draw you in. It's just something that I could easily take and then plug into like 5e, for example. It's just there. It doesn't make the game. The game is the core mechanics, which is rolling a d6 and rolling under, which has very serious flaws, by the way, which I've kind of already mentioned before. Like if you've got a player who really specs into a certain skill, then they're just going to be automatically succeeding in that. I don't really like that. I honestly would have preferred a greater threshold other than D6, like a D100, like Call of Cthulhu style or even Mothership style would have been much better. If I wanted to run a game that is heavily tied to the apocalypse, like I said, there are other systems that I could use, and I could also take these concepts from Ark and plug them into those systems. So is this really a system? I don't think so. I think this is just a how-to book, or at least that's how I interpreted it. And I actually, when I first read through this book, I had some really strong feelings about some of the mechanics in this book. And I was wondering what the point of this book was. Like, when I backed it on Kickstarter, I didn't really know why I was getting it, other than because it looked flashy. And it had Memento's name tied to it, which is somebody I don't even know, by the way. This book definitely takes some inspiration from Merkborg in terms of layout and presentation and, just plugging in artwork all over the place, which is really cool. Should you buy it? I mean, the artwork is gorgeous, but unlike Merkborg, this book is $60. Yeah, let that sit in for a second. There's 170 pages in this book. That's just a little bit less than $3 per page. And that's 170 pages of a rules light system. So let's compare that to other books around a similar price, like 5th edition Player's Handbook. Zweihander's is probably on the upper side of that range. I think Zweihander is like $70, but you're getting like 700 pages worth. And that's a very rules heavy system. But like Merkborg, for example, is like $35 on Exalted Funeral. By the way, you can get this book, or it was done with Exalted Funeral, so I assume that it's going to appear on Exalted Funeral at some point in the future. But $60 is a lot to ask for a very rules-light book that you're only going to play for a short amount of time. This is not a long-term campaign book by any means. This is something that you're going to play as a one-shot, maybe 2 or 3 different days for a couple of hours. Because if you're playing it as is with that Doomsday Clock, that's all that you're given. So if you like art books, then maybe $60 is a fair asking price. But if you're looking for a system to introduce to your gaming group, then you're going to have to ask yourself this pivotal question. Is $60 too much of a price for a very short campaign? And I think for most people, the answer is going to be no. So this is really more of a collector's item than anything. So there you go. Feel free to leave a comment down below. Give this video a huge thumbs up to support the series, and I will see you guys in the next video.